The dust had settled into the lines of Finian's face, a map of the long road that had led him to this quiet bend in the river. He hadn't seen another soul for 2 days, only the heat shimmering above the sagebrush and the slow, circling patience of a hawk overhead. The water, clear and cool, was an impossible invitation. It promised to wash away the grit not just from his skin, but from his memory. He tethered his horse where it could drink, stripped off his sweat-stained clothes, and waded into the gentle current. The shock of the cold was a clean and sudden mercy. He submerged himself completely, letting the river pull the exhaustion from his bones, the world reduced to a muffled rush, and the green, distorted light filtering through the surface. He surfaced with a gasp, slicking his hair back, feeling more human than he had in months. It was in that moment of profound peace that he saw them. On the bank, where there had been no one, stood 2 women. The elder was a small, formidable figure in a dress the color of dark jade, her face a web of intricate lines, her gaze as steady and unyielding as the ancient stones at the water's edge. Beside her, a young woman stood as still as a heron, her gray silk cheongsam a whisper of color against the sun-bleached landscape. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped loosely before her. Finian felt a sudden, sharp exposure that had nothing to do with his nakedness. He waded quickly towards his clothes, his heart hammering a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The old woman did not move. She waited until he had pulled on his trousers and shirt before she spoke, her voice surprisingly clear, carrying across the water with an unnerving authority. "You have bathed in the Shui Yuan," she stated, not as a question, but as a final judgment. "This is the source spring, our family's spring." Finian grabbed his hat, his mind racing. "Ma'am, I apologize. I saw no signs, no fence." The old woman's eyes, dark and knowing, did not waver. "There are other kinds of signs, older ones." She gestured with a slight nod towards the young woman who had not moved, had not even seemed to blink. "This is my daughter, Leanne. The tradition is absolute. Whoever bathes in this water must marry my daughter." Finian stared, the water dripping from his hair and tracing cold paths down his neck. The words hung in the oppressive summer air, seeming to warp the very light around them. He thought he must have misheard, that the sun had finally cooked his sense. He looked from the old woman Thin, whose expression was as fixed as a death mask, to the girl Leanne, who remained a silent effigy in gray silk. Her gaze was lowered now, fixed on the reeds at the river's edge, her stillness a profound counterpoint to the turmoil roaring through him. "Marry her," he finally managed, the words tasting like alkali dust. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I can't. I'm just passing through." Finn's lips thinned, a subtle shift that somehow made her seem more immovable. "The tradition does not care if you are passing through. The water does not care. You chose this place. The choice was made." He felt a surge of frustrated anger, a desperate need to break through the surreal calm of the scene. He was a man accustomed to clear dangers, a rattled snake, a drawn gun, a sudden storm. This was something else entirely, a trap made of quiet words and unshakable belief. He took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "Listen, I am truly sorry for the trespass. I will offer payment for the offense, whatever you think is fair." Finn's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Some things cannot be paid for with coin. An offense against a man can be settled. An offense against the spirits of this place requires a different price. It requires a bond." He looked again at Leanne. She had still not spoken, had not offered a single glance in his direction since he had begun to dress. Was she a party to this? A prisoner? An accomplice? Her silence was an unnerving void, offering no clues, no purchase for his arguments. He was a man used to reading people, to spotting the tell in a card player's eye or the fear in a liar's voice. But here there was nothing. Only the oppressive weight of tradition he could not comprehend, and the placid surface of a life he had accidentally shattered. His own life, which he had so carefully guarded, so fiercely kept separate and transient, was suddenly tangled in a web not of his own making. The hawk still circled overhead, indifferent. He spent that night by his horse, a small fire his only company, the conversation replaying in his mind until the words lost all meaning. He had argued, pleaded, even tried to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. Finn had simply stood her ground, her logic as circular and impenetrable as a stone wall. He would stay, she had insisted, in the old line shack at the edge of her property until he understood the gravity of his actions. To leave would be to invite misfortune not only upon himself, but upon her family. It was a veiled threat, delivered with the placid certainty of a prophetess. He had seen the way the few townsfolk in Serenity Flats gave her a wide berth, their respect curdled with a healthy dose of fear. He had no desire to test the limits of her influence or her curses. So he stayed. The shack was little more than a single room with a cot, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. It was clean, however, swept bare and smelling faintly of dried herbs. From his window he could see the main house, a low-slung adobe structure with a wide, shaded porch where Finn often sat in the evenings. And he saw Leanne. She moved through her days with a quiet, deliberate grace that was both captivating and maddening. She tended a small, flourishing garden of strange-looking vegetables, her hands deft and sure in the soil. She washed clothes in a wooden tub, her movements economical and fluid. She never looked towards his shack, yet he felt her awareness of him as a constant, humming presence in the air. Each evening she would walk the short distance from her house to his, carrying a covered bowl. She would place it on the small, weathered crate that served as his doorstep, give a single sharp rap on the door frame, and turn to walk away before he could even rise from his cot. The food was always simple, nourishing, and completely foreign to his palate. He ate every bite, the unfamiliar flavors a constant reminder of how far he was from any world he had ever known. He was a ghost on this small patch of land, caught between a past he was running from and a future that had been declared for him by a woman he did not know. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing stretching between the two houses, thick with unspoken questions and unyielding demands. Days bled into a week, then two. The rhythm of his confinement began to feel unsettlingly normal. He rose with the sun, the first blush of light painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and violet. He tended to his horse, whose leg was slowly mending, the initial excuse for his lingering stay now becoming less and less viable. He spent hours simply watching, observing the life that unfolded without his participation. He learned the subtle language of the place. He learned that Finn's silence was one of judgment, while Leanne's was one of quiet contemplation. He saw the way Leanne spoke to her plants, her fingers brushing against a leaf, her head cocked as if listening to a reply. He saw the immense, almost reverent care she took with her mother, helping her from her chair, preparing her tea exactly as she liked it, her patience seemingly infinite. He started to see not a trap, but a world, complete and contained and governed by rules he was only beginning to perceive. The townsfolk in Serenity Flats treated him like a curiosity. When he rode in for supplies, conversations would halt. Eyes would follow him down the single dusty street. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, was the only one who spoke to him directly. "Heard you ran afoul of the river witch," Gus had said, not unkindly, as he sold Finian a bag of oats. "She's a strange one, her. Been here longer than the town itself. Keeps to herself and her girl." Finian had only grunted in response, unwilling to give the town more gossip to chew on. Her husband was a railroad man, Gus continued, undeterred. Died in a tunnel collapse years back. She never left. Just her and the girl, living by that spring. Folks say the water has memory. Finian thought of the cold shock of that water, the feeling of being cleansed. He wondered what memories it held and what it had taken from him. One afternoon he saw that a section of the corral fence behind the main house had collapsed, the old wood split and weathered. He watched Leanne struggle with the heavy posts, her slight frame no match for the weight. He waited, expecting her to call for help that would never come. She did not. She simply kept trying, her persistence a quiet battle against the unyielding wood. After a long while, he left his shack, crossed the silent expanse between them, and picked up the other end of the post. She froze, her hands tight on the wood, her back to him. She did not speak. "This will go faster with two," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They worked together in silence, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm, the only sounds the scrape of wood and their shared breathing under the hot sun. The fence repair became a silent turning point. It did not break the tension, but it altered its texture. The silence between them was no longer purely one of avoidance. It now held a thin, fragile thread of shared purpose. He began to look for other tasks, small things that needed a man's strength. He repaired the leaky roof of the woodshed, reinforced the gate on the small chicken coop, and cleared the stubborn, deep-rooted brush from a patch of land adjacent to Leanne's garden. He never asked for permission. He simply saw a need and met it. And she, in her own way, began to respond. The bowl of food left on his doorstep was now sometimes accompanied by a small cup of hot, fragrant tea. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of digging out a stubborn tree stump, he found a small tin of salve next to his dinner, its scent sharp and medicinal. He rubbed it into his blistered hands, the cool relief a balm not just for his skin, but for the raw edges of his spirit. He had been a solitary man for so long, moving from one place to the next, his connections to others fleeting and transactional. He had built walls around himself, high and thick, to keep the past at bay. But here, in this strange captivity, he felt an unfamiliar stirring. It was the slow, creeping realization that he was being seen. Leanne saw his exhaustion, his effort, his unspoken needs, and he was seeing her. He saw the weariness in her shoulders at the end of the day, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes whenever she looked at her mother, the small, secret smile that touched her lips when a new sprout pushed its way through the soil in her garden. She was not the passive girl from the riverside, not the silent instrument of her mother's will. She was a woman of immense strength, her resilience forged in isolation and duty. Her world was small, but she tended it with a devotion that he found himself beginning to admire and even envy. He had roamed the entire territory, seeking a sense of freedom that always eluded him, while she had found a kind of grounded purpose in this single, dusty patch of earth. One evening, a summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the one he had been living in for weeks. The wind rose, whipping dust into swirling devils and rattling the loose frame of his shack. He stood in the doorway, watching the approaching curtain of rain, when he saw Leanne hurrying to bring in laundry from the line, the white sheets snapping and fighting against her like angry ghosts. A particularly violent gust ripped a sheet from her grasp and sent it tumbling across the yard. Without thinking, he ran out, chasing it down, his boots pounding against the thirsty ground. He caught it just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to dark, spreading stains. He handed it to her, and for the first time their hands brushed. Her skin was cool, her touch feather light, yet it sent a jolt through him as potent as the lightning that suddenly split the sky. They ran for the cover of the main house's porch just as the heavens opened, the rain coming down in a solid, deafening sheet. They stood there breathless and soaked, water dripping from their hair and clothes. The world outside dissolved into a roaring gray chaos. The porch became an island, a temporary sanctuary. Inside, he could see Finn sitting in her chair, seemingly unperturbed by the storm's fury. Leanne did not look at him, but she did not move away either. They stood side by side, inches apart, watching the deluge. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it over the sound of the rain. It was the first time she had spoken to him since that day at the river. "You're welcome," he replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was softer, filled not with tension, but with the shared experience of the storm. He could smell the rain, the wet earth, and the faint, clean scent of the soap from the laundry she had rescued. He found himself wanting to say something more, to ask her a question, any question, that might keep her there, that might bridge the small but significant gap that still separated them. The storm raged for nearly an hour, trapping them on the porch. The world shrank to that small, sheltered space. The roar of the rain made conversation difficult, so they simply existed in the quiet companionship of the moment. He leaned against a porch post, and she stood near the door, her arms crossed as she watched the water cascade from the roof. He studied her profile in the dim, storm-darkened light. He saw the elegant curve of her neck, the way a few stray strands of wet hair clung to her temple. He realized with a start that he had stopped thinking of her as a component of his problem and had started thinking of her simply as a woman, a quiet, resilient, and strangely beautiful woman. When the rain finally began to soften, tapering to a steady drizzle, she turned to him. Her eyes, which he had only ever seen as downcast or guarded, met his directly. They were dark and deep, and in them he saw not anger or resentment, but a profound and weary acceptance of her life. "My mother is not a cruel woman," she said, as if she had heard the silent question he'd been asking for weeks. "She is afraid. This land, it takes things. It took my father. It tries to take everything. Her traditions are the only walls she has left." He nodded slowly, understanding. He knew about building walls. "And you?" he asked, the word leaving his lips before he could stop it. "Are they your walls too?" A flicker of something, sadness perhaps, or longing, passed through her eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. "They are my inheritance," she said simply. "It is all I have ever known." The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air cool and smelling of wet soil and sage. The setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the landscape in a soft, golden light. It felt like a new beginning. She gave him a small, hesitant nod, a gesture of dismissal that also felt like an acknowledgement, and then she slipped inside the house, the door closing softly behind her. He remained on the porch for a long time, watching the light fade, the scent of the rain all around him. He thought of his own inheritance, a legacy of violence and running. He had spent years trying to outrun it, only to find himself standing still on a stranger's porch, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. The trap was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a shelter from a different kind of storm. In the days that followed, the change was undeniable. The silence between them was now porous, occasionally punctuated by brief, practical conversations. He would ask her if she needed more water drawn from the well. She would tell him when the supply wagon was due in town. They were small, insignificant exchanges, yet each one felt like a stone being laid for a new foundation. He started taking his evening meal on the steps of his shack instead of inside, and sometimes, from her porch, she would watch him. He never looked up, but he felt her gaze, and it was no longer a weight, but a quiet point of focus in the vast emptiness of the landscape. One afternoon he was working on reshoeing his horse when he saw her walking back from the river, her steps slow, her shoulders slumped. He watched her for a moment, a knot of unfamiliar concern tightening in his chest. He put down his tools and walked to the well, drawing a fresh bucket of cool water. He met her halfway between the house and the river. "You look tired," he said, holding the dipper out to her. She stopped, surprised, and looked at the offering. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She took the dipper, her fingers brushing his again, a touch that was now familiar, and drank deeply. "My mother is not well," she said, her voice strained. "The heat affects her mind sometimes. She gets lost." He understood then the true weight of her inheritance. It was not just tradition. It was the relentless, solitary burden of care. "Is there anything I can do?" She shook her head, handing the dipper back to him. "There is nothing to be done. It will pass. It always does." But he saw the lie in her eyes, the deep-seated fear that one day it would not pass. He saw the profound loneliness of her vigil. He looked back at the small adobe house, at the empty chair on the porch, and then back at her. He thought of all the empty roads he had traveled, the hollow freedom he had chased. It all seemed meaningless compared to the fierce, quiet loyalty that anchored this woman to this one small spot on the earth. "You shouldn't have to do it alone," he said, the words simple and true. For the first time he saw her composure crack. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she looked away toward the distant mountains. The next morning he rose earlier than usual. He chopped a week's worth of firewood and stacked it neatly by her door. He mended the hinge on the screen door that had been squeaking for weeks. He did not do it for Finn's approval or to fulfill some unspoken obligation. He did it for Leanne. He did it because the sight of her solitary struggle had lodged itself deep inside him. When she emerged from the house, she saw the stacked wood, saw the silent door, and she stopped. She looked over at him where he was currying his horse, and he met her gaze across the yard. He gave a slight nod. She returned it. It was a complete conversation held in a single moment of shared understanding. Later that day he found her in the garden, listlessly pulling weeds. He walked over, his shadow falling over her. "Show me," he said. She looked up, confused. "Show me which are weeds and which are not." Hesitantly, she pointed out the intruders. He knelt in the dirt beside her and began to work, his large, calloused hands moving carefully through the soil. They worked side by side for over an hour, the silence comfortable, the shared task a form of communion. He learned the names of the strange plants she grew, bok choy, daikon, ginger. She spoke of them with a quiet passion, explaining how each one had its own needs, its own purpose. He listened, fascinated not just by the information but by the sound of her voice, the way it softened when she spoke of the things she nurtured. He realized he was seeing her world through her eyes, a world not of barren dust and isolation, but of hidden life and subtle connections. "My father brought the first seeds," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He said we must have a piece of home here, or we would lose ourselves." Finian looked at her hands, stained with the same earth that now clung to his own. He thought of his own lack of home, of the way he had shed every place he had ever been like a snake sheds its skin, believing it was the only way to stay free. He was beginning to understand that some roots did not trap you, they held you. They gave you a place to stand against the wind. The sun beat down on their backs, but for the first time, the heat did not feel oppressive. It felt like a shared warmth. The arrangement, once a source of deep resentment, had faded into the background of their lives, replaced by a routine of quiet collaboration. The forced proximity had given way to a chosen closeness. The town of Serenity Flats still watched, but their whispers no longer reached him. Their judgment was a distant noise, muffled by the new, quiet reality he was building. He was no longer a prisoner, but a partner. He was no longer just passing through. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, he was sitting on his step cleaning his saddle leathers. Leanne came out of the house, and, instead of leaving his meal on the crate, she walked over and sat on the step below him. She held 2 bowls. She handed one to him. The gesture was so simple, so profound, that it left him momentarily speechless. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a silence full of meaning. It was the silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand one another. The boundary between their 2 worlds, once a stark and impassable line, had been erased. When they finished, she did not immediately get up to leave. She sat there tracing a pattern in the dust with her finger. "The river," she said softly, not looking at him. "The tradition. It is about protection. For a woman alone, a family is a fortress. My mother, she sees the world as a danger. She wanted to build a wall for me that no one could tear down." "And what do you see?" he asked, his voice low. She finally looked up at him, and in the twilight her eyes seemed to hold all the sorrow and strength he had come to know. "I see a man who fixed my fence," she said. It was everything. It was an acknowledgment of all the silent work, all the unspoken gestures. It was an acceptance of him, not as a consequence of tradition, but as the man he had chosen to be since that day. He looked out at the vast landscape, at the darkening plains that had once represented an escape. Now, looking at the small house, the tended garden, the woman sitting beside him, he knew he had been running toward something all along, not away from it. He had just never known what it was. This, he thought, this quiet place, this shared meal on a dusty step. This was the home he had never realized he was searching for.